It was a Saturday afternoon in late September when I decided to throw a small garage party to celebrate my promotion at the police department. Nothing too extravagant, just some close friends, family, and a few colleagues from the precinct who had become like brothers and sisters to me over the years. And I had spent the entire morning setting up the garage with string lights, a folding table loaded with snacks and drinks, a small speaker system playing classic rock at a reasonable volume, and I even rolled out my vintage motorcycle that I'd been restoring for the past 3 years as a centerpiece because I was proud of the work I'd put into it and wanted to show it off to people who actually appreciated craftsmanship and dedication. The party was scheduled to start at 2 in the afternoon and wrap up by 8 in the evening, well within the HOA's noise ordinance guidelines, which stated that residents could host gatherings until 10 p.m. on weekends as long as the noise didn't exceed reasonable levels, and I had made sure to read through the entire HOA handbook the night before just to ensure I wasn't violating any rules, because the last thing I wanted was trouble with the homeowners association, especially since I'd only moved into this suburban neighborhood 6 months ago, after finally saving up enough for a down payment on my dream house, a cozy 3-bedroom ranch with a 2-car garage and a decent-sized backyard where my dog Bruno, a lovable German Shepherd mix, could run around freely. My neighbors on both sides were friendly enough. The Johnsons to my left were a retired couple who mostly kept to themselves but always waved when they saw me, and the Martinezes to my right were a young family with 2 kids who occasionally asked me to keep an eye on their house when they went on vacation. But directly across the street lived Patricia Hendrickson, a woman in her late 50s who had appointed herself the unofficial enforcer of every HOA rule ever written and several that she seemed to have invented in her own mind. And from the moment I moved in, she had made it her personal mission to monitor my every move, commenting on everything from the height of my grass, which was apparently a 1/4 inch too tall 1 week, to the color of my mailbox, which she insisted should be black instead of the bronze I had chosen to match my house numbers. And I had tried my best to be accommodating and polite, even going so far as to change the mailbox and mow my lawn twice a week just to keep the peace. But nothing I did ever seemed to satisfy her perpetual need to find fault with something. The guests started arriving around 2:15, and the first to show up were my parents, who were beaming with pride about my promotion to detective, followed by my younger sister Amanda and her husband Rick, and then my buddies from the gym, Marcus and Tony, who immediately gravitated toward the motorcycle and started asking technical questions about the engine rebuild I'd done. And within an hour, the garage was filled with about 20 people, all laughing, chatting, enjoying the food, and having a genuinely good time in a way that made me feel grateful for the community I'd built around myself despite working long and often unpredictable hours in law enforcement. Around 3:30, some of my colleagues from the precinct arrived, including my partner, Detective Sarah Chen, who brought her girlfriend Kelly, Sergeant James Rodriguez, who came with his wife and their teenage son, and Officers Mike Peterson and Jennifer Walsh, who were off-duty and happy to relax after a particularly tough week of back-to-back shifts. And the atmosphere was exactly what I'd hoped for, relaxed and celebratory without being rowdy or disruptive, and I had even walked around the neighborhood perimeter a few times to check the noise level from the street, confirming that you could barely hear the music once you were more than 2 houses away, and I felt confident that we were being respectful to everyone around us. But I should have known that Patricia Hendrickson would find something to complain about, and sure enough, around 4 o'clock, I noticed her standing on her front porch with her arms crossed, staring daggers at my house with the kind of contempt usually reserved for people who commit actual crimes, and I considered going over to speak with her, maybe invite her to join us or at least reassure her that we'd be done well before the noise ordinance kicked in. But before I could make a move, she had already stormed back inside her house, slamming her front door so hard that I could hear it from across the street, and I figured she was just being her usual unpleasant self and would probably send me a strongly worded email through the HOA portal on Monday morning, which I could deal with then. What I didn't expect was that 15 minutes later, at approximately 4:17 p.m., according to the dispatch log I would later review, Patricia Hendrickson dialed 911 and reported that there was a massive disturbance at my address, claiming that there were dozens of suspicious individuals engaged in potentially illegal activity with excessively loud music that was shaking her windows, and that she felt threatened and unsafe in her own home, and the emergency dispatcher, following protocol for any call that mentioned feeling threatened, immediately sent out a response. And because Patricia had specifically used language suggesting possible criminal activity, and had mentioned seeing what appeared to be weapons, which was actually just the tools I had laid out on my workbench for the motorcycle restoration. The dispatcher elevated the call priority and sent multiple units to respond, including a supervisor, which meant that instead of one patrol car doing a routine noise check, my quiet neighborhood was about to be descended upon by half the Saturday shift from the precinct where I worked. I was inside the garage showing my dad the new brake system I'd installed on the motorcycle when I heard the first siren in the distance, and I didn't think much of it because sirens were a constant background noise in my life. But then I heard a second one, and a third, and they were getting closer, and Marcus, who had been a Marine before becoming a personal trainer, stepped outside to take a look and came back with a confused expression on his face, saying, dude, I think the cops are coming here, and I laughed it off because surely there was no way police were responding to my house, where half the people at the party were literally law enforcement officers. But then I heard the sirens turn onto my street and suddenly go silent the way they do when units are arriving at a scene, and I walked out of the garage just in time to see 3 patrol cars pulling up in front of my house with their lights still flashing, and my first thought was that this had to be some kind of joke, maybe a surprise visit from more coworkers. But the confused looks on the responding officers' faces told me this was very much not a joke. The first officer out of the lead patrol car was Officer David Chen, Sarah's younger brother who had joined the force 2 years ago, and the moment he saw me standing in my driveway wearing a World's Okayest Detective t-shirt that Sarah had given me as a gag gift, his hand instinctively moved away from his duty belt and his expression shifted from alert readiness to complete bewilderment, and he called out Detective Morrison. We got a 911 call about a disturbance at this address, and I could see him looking past me into the garage where Sergeant Rodriguez was very obviously standing there in his off-duty clothes holding a plate of potato salad, and the other responding officers, Jennifer Walsh and a rookie whose name I couldn't immediately remember, were equally confused as they recognized not just me but half the party guests as their colleagues and supervisors. Patricia Hendrickson had apparently heard the sirens and had rushed back out to her front porch, probably expecting to watch me get arrested or at least severely reprimanded, and she was already launching into a dramatic monologue, directed at the officers about how I had been terrorizing the neighborhood for months, with my flagrant disregard for community standards, and how this party was the final straw in my pattern of antisocial behavior, and she demanded that the officers do their jobs and shut down this illegal gathering immediately, and I watched as Officer Chen's expression shifted from confusion to recognition, to barely suppressed amusement as he realized what had actually happened here, which was that a vindictive HOA busybody had called 911 with exaggerated and false claims about a police detective's backyard barbecue that was being attended by other police officers. And the irony of the situation was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been my supervising officer when I first made detective and was notorious for his no-nonsense attitude and his ability to smell BS from a mile away, walked out of the garage wiping his hands on a napkin and surveyed the scene with the kind of calm authority that comes from 30 years of dealing with every kind of nonsense imaginable. And he looked at Officer Chen and said, "What's the call, Chen?" And Officer Chen, trying his best to maintain his professional composure, replied, "Sir, we received a 911 call reporting a large disturbance, possible illegal activity, threat, and excessive noise at this address." And there was a brief moment of silence before Sergeant Rodriguez turned to look at Patricia across the street and asked in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Ma'am, are you the one who called 911? And Patricia, apparently not reading the room at all, puffed up with self-righteous indignation and declared, "Yes, I did, and it's about time Simeone took action against this absolute menace," gesturing wildly at me like I was running a drug cartel instead of hosting a family-friendly promotion party. And Sergeant Rodriguez, in that special tone he reserved for people who were about to learn a very important lesson about wasting police resources, said, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step over here and speak with us for a moment." And suddenly Patricia's confidence seemed to waver just slightly as she realized that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to play out the way she had imagined. That by this point, more of my party guests had emerged from the garage to see what was happening, including my partner Sarah, who took one look at her brother in uniform standing in my driveway and immediately understood the entire situation, and she had to turn away to hide the fact that she was laughing so hard her shoulders were shaking, and my parents, who are both retired teachers and have never so much as gotten a parking ticket in their entire lives, looked absolutely mortified that police cars were parked in front of their son's house even though they knew intellectually that nothing wrong was happening, and my sister Amanda, who has always had a flair for the dramatic, whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Oh my God, is that the HOA lady who's been harassing you? She actually called the cops on your party." And I had to shush her because while the situation was absurd, I didn't want to make it worse by having my guests pile on, even though Patricia absolutely deserved every bit of embarrassment that was about to come her way. Officer Chen, following proper procedure despite the bizarre circumstances, asked me to explain what was going on, and I calmly laid out the facts, that I was hosting a small gathering to celebrate my promotion, that I had checked the HOA guidelines to ensure compliance, that the party had started at 2 p.m. and was scheduled to end by 8 p.m., that the noise level was well within acceptable limits, and that the guest list consisted primarily of family members and fellow law enforcement officers. And as I was explaining this, Officer Walsh was walking around the perimeter of my property with a decibel meter, which was probably overkill, but I appreciated the thoroughness. And she reported back that the noise level at the property line was reading at approximately 55 decibels, which was about the same as a normal conversation and well below the 75 decibel threshold for the noise ordinance. And Officer Chen dutifully documented all of this in his notepad while Patricia continued to sputter protests from across the street about how the noise level readings were obviously wrong and how she could barely hear herself think in her own home, despite the fact that her house was a good 80 feet away from my garage and there were multiple mature trees between our properties that provided significant sound buffering. What Patricia didn't know, and what was about to make this situation go from bad to catastrophically worse for her, was that filing a false police report is actually a crime, and while officers generally have discretion in how they handle these situations, the fact that she had specifically claimed to feel threatened and had mentioned seeing weapons meant that this wasn't just a noise complaint that could be dismissed with a warning. This was a 911 call that had pulled multiple units away from actual emergencies and had sent officers racing across town with lights and sirens based on completely fabricated claims. And Sergeant Rodriguez, who I could see was becoming less amused and more genuinely angry as the full scope of Patricia's lies became clear, made a decision that was going to turn Patricia's petty revenge plot into a massive backfire. He instructed Officer Chen to interview Patricia formally about her 911 call, and as Chen pulled out his body camera and started asking her to repeat her claims on camera, I could see the exact moment when Patricia realized she might have made a terrible mistake, and her confident, indignant tone started to falter as she tried to backpedal on some of her more extreme claims, saying things like, "Well, I may have been a bit mistaken about the weapons, but I was certain I saw something suspicious and the noise might not be that loud right at this exact moment, but it was much worse earlier." And Officer Chen, with the kind of professional patience that comes from dealing with hundreds of BS calls, asked her very specifically, "Ma'am, did you or did you not tell the 911 dispatcher that you felt threatened and unsafe?" And Patricia, apparently not understanding that she should stop talking immediately and possibly consult with a lawyer, doubled down and said, "Yes, I absolutely feel threatened by having such activities in this residential neighborhood," which was just about the worst thing she could have said because now she was on camera, making claims that were demonstrably false while standing in the middle of a peaceful suburban street on a sunny Saturday afternoon surrounded by police officers who could all testify that there was no legitimate threat present. Meanwhile, back in my garage, the party had taken on a surreal quality as my guests watched the drama unfold, like it was a live episode of some police procedural TV show, and Marcus had started making popcorn in my microwave because he said this is better than anything on Netflix, and my dad, after recovering from his initial shock, was now thoroughly enjoying the fact that his son's annoying neighbor was getting her comeuppance, and he kept making comments under his breath about how some people just can't let others enjoy themselves, which was his version of trash talk since he was generally one of the most mild-mannered people you'd ever meet. Sarah came over to stand next to me and whispered, "Do you think Rodriguez is actually going to cite her?" And I shrugged because, honestly, I had no idea. On one hand, filing a false police report is technically a misdemeanor, and Patricia had absolutely wasted police resources with her bogus 911 call. But on the other hand, most officers wouldn't bother with the paperwork for something like this unless the person was being particularly belligerent or had a history of making false reports. But then again, Patricia had specifically targeted a law enforcement officer's home and had made demonstrably false claims about weapons and threats, which might cross a line that Rodriguez wasn't willing to let slide, especially since it could have resulted in a very different kind of response if the address hadn't been recognized as belonging to a detective, and if the responding officers had approached the situation as an actual high-risk call instead of the routine noise check they had expected. The situation took another turn when Lieutenant Catherine Parks, who was the weekend shift supervisor and someone I had worked with on several major cases, arrived on scene after hearing the address over the radio and wondering why 3 of her units were tied up at a single location. And the moment she stepped out of her patrol SUV and saw me standing in my driveway, she stopped, looked around at the assembled officers and party guests, looked over at Patricia, who was still being interviewed by Officer Chen, and then looked back at me with an expression that said, "You have got to be kidding me." And I gave her a sheepish wave and said, "Hey, Lieutenant, sorry about this, I was just hosting a small party for my promotion." And she shook her head with a mixture of exasperation and amusement and replied, "Morrison, only you could get 3 units dispatched to your own backyard barbecue." And then she walked over to confer with Sergeant Rodriguez about what exactly was happening and what response was appropriate. I watched them have a low-voiced conversation that involved a lot of head shaking and occasional glances over at Patricia. And at one point Lieutenant Parks pulled out her phone and appeared to be checking something, possibly the original 911 call recording or the dispatch notes, and after about 5 minutes of discussion, she and Rodriguez walked over to where Officer Chen was still attempting to get a coherent statement from Patricia, and Lieutenant Parks introduced herself and explained in very formal, very professional language that Patricia had filed what appeared to be a false police report, that the claims she had made to the 911 dispatcher were not supported by the facts on the ground, that filing a false police report was a violation of the state criminal code, and that Patricia needed to understand the seriousness of what she had done. Patricia's response to this was to essentially have a meltdown right there in the middle of the street, insisting that she was the victim in all of this, that she had every right to call 911 if she felt threatened, that the police were clearly biased because they were friends with me, and that she was going to file a complaint with the city council, the mayor, the police chief, and anyone else who would listen about the incompetence and corruption she was witnessing. And I had to admire her commitment to doubling down on a terrible position, even when it was obvious to everyone present that she had no leg to stand on. And Lieutenant Parks, who I had seen remain calm in situations involving actual armed criminals, listened to this entire tirade with the patient expression of someone who had heard every excuse in the book, and wasn't impressed by any of them. And when Patricia finally ran out of steam, Parks very calmly explained that if Patricia wished to file complaints, she was welcome to do so through the proper channels, but that those complaints would be investigated alongside the question of whether Patricia had violated the law by filing a false report, and that Patricia might want to seriously consider whether she wanted to continue making accusations of bias and corruption. When there were multiple witnesses and body camera footage documenting the entire interaction, the implied threat of actually being charged with filing a false report seemed to finally penetrate Patricia's wall of righteous indignation, and she suddenly became much quieter and more subdued, though she continued to mutter under her breath about how this was all unfair, and how she was being persecuted for trying to maintain community standards. And I almost felt sorry for her because it was clear that she had built up this entire narrative in her head about me being some kind of troublemaker who needed to be stopped, and the cognitive dissonance of discovering that I was actually a well-respected detective hosting a perfectly legal party with other police officers was just too much for her to process in a way that allowed her to admit she'd been wrong. Lieutenant Parks ultimately decided not to formally charge Patricia with filing a false report, though she did issue her an official warning that would be documented in the system, and she made it very clear that if Patricia ever filed another questionable 911 call, particularly one involving my address, it would be taken very seriously and could result in criminal charges. And Patricia, deflated and humiliated, mumbled something that might have been an acknowledgement and then retreated back into her house, probably to call the HOA president and complain about the injustice of it all. And as the patrol cars prepared to clear the scene, several of the responding officers came over to apologize for the interruption, even though none of this was their fault. And Officer Chen, Sarah's brother, was particularly embarrassed because he'd never had to respond to a call involving his sister and her partner before, and he kept saying, "This is so weird, I'm really sorry," until Sarah finally told him to stop apologizing, because he'd done everything exactly right, and this was entirely Patricia's fault for being a vindictive busybody with too much time on her hands. As the official police response wrapped up and the patrol cars pulled away, my party guests started filtering back into the garage with a renewed energy, because nothing bonds people together quite like collectively witnessing someone make a complete fool of themselves through their own petty maliciousness. And suddenly what had been a pleasant but fairly low-key gathering transformed into the kind of party that people would be talking about for years, and multiple guests pulled out their phones to record statements for the inevitable retellings of that time the HOA Karen called the cops on a detectives party, and the entire precinct showed up, and my dad declared it the best promotion party in history and insisted on taking a group photo of everyone in front of my garage with the caption "No laws broken here," despite what the neighbors say, which I knew would end up in the family photo album alongside pictures of graduations and weddings. The party continued until about 7:30, a bit earlier than I'd originally planned, but honestly after all the excitement with the police response, people were starting to naturally wind down, and as guests began leaving, several of them made a point of loudly thanking me for the wonderful party and complimenting how well organized and respectful it had been. Statements that were clearly directed at Patricia's house across the street in case she was watching from behind her curtains, which I was pretty sure she was. And Sarah and Kelly were among the last to leave, and before they headed out, Sarah hugged me and said, "You know, this isn't going to be the end of it, right? She's going to make your life hell through the HOA." And I acknowledged that she was probably right, but figured that after the humiliation of having her false 911 call exposed in front of multiple police officers, Patricia might think twice before coming after me again, though I also knew that people like her often doubled down when embarrassed rather than learning from their mistakes. So I should probably prepare myself for an escalation of HOA-related harassment in the coming weeks. After everyone had left and I was cleaning up the garage, putting away leftover food and taking down the string lights, Bruno came and sat next to me with his head on my knee, probably wondering why there had been so many people and so much excitement, and I scratched behind his ears and thought about how bizarre the whole afternoon had been, how a simple celebration of a career milestone had turned into a neighborhood incident that would probably be discussed at the next HOA meeting and might even make its way into the local community Facebook groups where people loved to gossip about anything out of the ordinary. On Monday morning, I arrived at work to find that the story had already spread throughout the precinct, because apparently Officer Chen had mentioned it during shift change, and Sergeant Rodriguez had told a few people, and by the time gossip in a police station makes it through 2 or 3 people, everyone knows about it, and I was greeted with a chorus of jokes and comments about keeping it too real in the suburbs and making the neighborhood safer one barbecue at a time, and someone had even printed out a fake certificate declaring me detective most likely to get swatted by his own department, which they'd taped to my desk. And while I rolled my eyes and pretended to be annoyed, I was actually pretty amused by the whole thing because it was nice to be known for something other than just casework for once, even if that something was having an HOA Karen call 911 on my promotion party. Lieutenant Parks called me into her office and for a second I was worried that maybe I was actually in trouble somehow, but she just wanted to give me a heads up that she'd documented the incident thoroughly, and that if Patricia Hendrickson did try to file complaints about bias or misconduct, there would be a clear paper trail showing exactly what had happened and why. And she also mentioned that she'd spoken to the HOA president, who was apparently a reasonable person, unlike Patricia, and explained the situation so that I wouldn't be blindsided by any disciplinary actions from the homeowners association. And I was grateful for her thoroughness, because the last thing I needed was to have fought so hard to buy a house only to end up in some prolonged battle with the HOA over fabricated violations. Sure enough, on Tuesday evening I received an email from the HOA with Patricia Hendrickson CC'd, and my heart sank as I opened it expecting some kind of formal complaint or fine. But instead it was from the HOA president, a man named Robert Chen, who was, coincidentally, Officer David Chen's uncle and who had apparently heard the full story from multiple sources by this point. And the email was actually an apology for the incident and an assurance that the HOA board would be reviewing their procedures for handling resident complaints to ensure that personal vendettas couldn't be pursued through official channels, and he made it clear that my party had been in full compliance with all HOA rules and that no violations would be recorded against my property. And at the bottom of the email was a single line addressed to Patricia reminding her that harassment of fellow residents was itself a violation of the HOA bylaws and could result in fines or other penalties. And I may have done a small victory dance in my kitchen after reading that, because it felt like justice in a way that was deeply satisfying. Patricia, predictably, did not take this well, and over the next few weeks she sent several lengthy emails to the HOA board arguing that there was a conspiracy against her, that I had somehow manipulated the police response, and that the HOA president was showing favoritism because of family connections, which wasn't entirely wrong since Robert Chen was related to David Chen, but the favoritism she was imagining didn't actually exist because the facts of the situation were clear regardless of anyone's family relationships, and her increasingly unhinged messages to the HOA board ultimately resulted in her being removed from her unofficial position as Neighborhood Watch Coordinator, a role she had apparently appointed herself 2 years ago, without any actual authority, and this removal seemed to break something in her because she became even more hostile and antagonistic in the following months. The situation escalated again, about 6 weeks later when I came home from work one evening to find that someone had filed a formal complaint with the City Code Enforcement Office claiming that my house was in violation of multiple ordinances, including having an unregistered vehicle on the property. This was my motorcycle, which was completely registered and legal, maintaining an excessive grass height, which was false as I'd literally mowed the lawn 2 days earlier, and storing hazardous materials in a residential area, which I could only assume referred to the motor, oil, and gasoline. I kept in approved safety containers in my garage for the motorcycle maintenance, all of which were completely legal and properly stored, and while the complaint was filed anonymously, I had exactly zero doubt about who had submitted it, especially since the complaint included phrases like ongoing pattern of irresponsible behavior and threat to community standards, which were basically Patricia's catchphrases at this point. The code enforcement officer who came out to inspect my property was a middle-aged woman named Janet, who had clearly been doing this job long enough to spot a BS complaint from a mile away, and she went through the motions of checking everything on the complaint form, confirmed that my motorcycle was properly registered, measured my grass and found it to be well within acceptable height, examined my garage storage and found everything in compliance with safety regulations, and then she sighed and said, "Let me guess, you've got a neighbor who doesn't like you." And I explained the whole situation with Patricia and the 911 call, which Janet apparently had already heard about through the local government gossip network, and she shook her head and said, "We get a lot of complaints from that address about various neighbors over the years, and honestly most of them are unfounded, but we have to investigate every single one, which is a waste of city resources," and she assured me that she would mark the complaint as unfounded, and note in the system that the complaints appeared to be harassing in nature, which might provide some protection if Patricia continued filing false reports. I documented everything that was happening, keeping copies of all emails, taking photos of my property showing that it was in compliance with all regulations, and even starting a log of every interaction I had with Patricia or that involved her complaints about me, because I had learned from years of police work that documentation was your best defense against false accusations, and I was building a case that would be very hard to refute if things ever escalated to the point where I needed to pursue legal action for harassment. My neighbors, the Johnsons and the Martinezes, had both reached out after hearing about the 911 incident, and they both admitted that Patricia had been a problem for them as well over the years, with constant complaints about everything from their choice of holiday decorations to the times they came and went from their houses. And Mr. Johnson told me that Patricia had once called the city to complain that his rose bushes were too vigorous and were encroaching on the visual space of the neighborhood, which was such an absurd complaint that even he had to laugh about it, though he noted that it had still required his time and energy to deal with the inspection and paperwork. And Mrs. Martinez mentioned that Patricia had tried to get them cited for having their kids' bikes on the front lawn, claiming it was visual clutter that decreased property values, and she said that after years of dealing with Patricia's complaints, they had just learned to ignore her and document everything in case she ever went too far, which seemed to be the common coping strategy for everyone who lived near her. The next major incident came in December, about 3 months after the garage party incident, when I decided to put up Christmas lights on my house. Nothing excessive or garish, just simple white icicle lights along the roofline and a modest lit wreath on my front door, and I made absolutely sure to check the HOA guidelines about holiday decorations before putting up a single light, confirming that decorations were allowed from December 1st through January 6th, and that they needed to be white or traditional Christmas colors, which mine were, and yet somehow, on the very evening that I finished installing the lights, I found a printed notice taped to my front door claiming that my holiday display was in violation of HOA rules and needed to be removed immediately or I would face fines. And the notice was not on official HOA letterhead and was not signed by any board member. It was just a typed-up document that someone had clearly created and printed at home, and I once again had zero doubt about who that someone was. I took photos of the notice and of my holiday lights, sent an email to the HOA president Robert Chen asking if this was an official notice, and received a reply within an hour confirming that it was absolutely not official, that my decorations were completely compliant with HOA rules, and that the board would be sending out a message to all residents reminding them that only official HOA communications on proper letterhead had any authority, which was clearly directed at Patricia even though she wasn't mentioned by name. And Robert also mentioned that the board was considering implementing penalties for residents who impersonated HOA authority or distributed fake violation notices, which would definitely apply to Patricia's little stunt with my door. Patricia's campaign of petty harassment continued through the winter with various small incidents, like the time she claimed my trash cans were visible from the street more than 30 minutes after collection time, which they weren't because I always brought them in as soon as I got home from work, or the time she reported that Bruno was barking excessively, which was laughable because Bruno was possibly the quietest dog in the entire neighborhood and mostly just slept on the couch all day while I was at work, or the time she called the city to report that I was running a home business without a permit, based on the fact that I sometimes had police vehicles in my driveway when my partner Sarah came over to discuss cases, which was somehow in Patricia's mind evidence of illegal commercial activity, and each complaint was investigated and dismissed, and each time I documented everything and added it to my growing file of evidence of harassment, and I started to wonder how much longer this could go on before something had to give, because Patricia seemed pathologically incapable of just letting things go, and living her life without monitoring my every move. The turning point came in March, almost 6 months after the original garage party incident, when I was working an evening shift and came home around 11 p.m. to find that someone had spray-painted criminal in large red letters across my garage door, and this was absolutely not something I was going to let slide because this was vandalism, this was property damage, and unlike all the false complaints and petty harassment, this was an actual crime that I could and would pursue, so I immediately called it in to the non-emergency line, took extensive photos of the damage, and canvassed my neighbors to see if anyone had seen anything or had security cameras that might have caught the vandal in action. The Martinezes had a Ring doorbell camera that faced partially toward the street, and while it hadn't captured the act of vandalism directly, it had captured footage of Patricia Hendrickson walking past my house around 9 p.m. that evening carrying what appeared to be a shopping bag, and then walking back past my house about 30 minutes later without the bag. And while this wasn't conclusive proof of anything, it was certainly suspicious, especially given the ongoing pattern of harassment, and when the responding officers arrived to take the report, I explained the entire history of incidents with Patricia, showed them my documentation, and requested that they interview her as a potential suspect, which they did the following morning. Patricia denied any involvement in the vandalism, of course, claiming that she had simply been out for an evening walk, which was her right as a resident of the neighborhood, and that the shopping bag had contained items she was donating to a charity drop box to streets over, and she seemed genuinely offended that anyone would suggest she was capable of vandalism, despite the fact that she had spent the past 6 months making my life miserable in every way she could think of. And the investigating officer, who was not someone from my precinct but rather from a different district to avoid any conflicts of interest, told me privately that while Patricia was definitely suspicious and the circumstantial evidence was suggestive, they didn't have enough for charges without either a confession or forensic evidence linking her to the spray paint. So unless I wanted to pursue expensive forensic testing on what was essentially a misdemeanor vandalism case, the investigation would probably go nowhere, and I was frustrated but not surprised because I'd worked enough cases to know that not every crime gets solved, especially relatively minor property crimes where the evidence is limited. I had the garage door professionally cleaned and repainted, which cost me about $400 that I definitely shouldn't have had to spend, and I added the vandalism incident and all associated costs to my documentation, because at this point I was seriously considering getting a restraining order or filing a civil harassment lawsuit against Patricia, something I had been avoiding because I didn't want to be that neighbor who escalated every dispute to legal action. But there was only so much I could take before I needed to protect myself and my property through whatever legal means were available. The situation finally reached its conclusion in a way I never could have predicted, when in April the HOA held its annual board elections, and Patricia Hendrickson decided to run for a position on the board, presumably so she could have actual authority to enforce all the petty rules and regulations she'd been making up in her head for years, and she campaigned heavily, going door to door and sending mass emails about restoring community standards and holding irresponsible residents accountable, and it was pretty clear to everyone who she was really talking about, even though she never mentioned me by name. But what Patricia didn't count on was that her years of harassing multiple neighbors had made her deeply unpopular with most of the community. And when Robert Chen, who was running for re-election as HOA president, mentioned during the annual meeting that the board would be implementing new policies to prevent harassment and abuse of HOA processes, he was met with enthusiastic applause from pretty much everyone except Patricia and maybe 2 or 3 of her friends. And when the votes were counted, Patricia received only 7 votes out of over 200 households, losing by a landslide that was honestly embarrassing, and Robert Chen was re-elected, along with several other reasonable board members who immediately passed a resolution stating that residents who filed repeated false complaints or engaged in harassment of neighbors could be fined and potentially have their HOA voting privileges suspended. And while the resolution didn't name Patricia specifically, everyone knew exactly who it was aimed at. And after that humiliating defeat and the threat of actual consequences, Patricia finally seemed to back off. And while she still gave me dirty looks whenever she saw me, and I'm sure she still complained about me to anyone who would listen, the constant barrage of false complaints and harassment attempts finally stopped, and I was able to just live my life in peace, enjoying my house and my dog and my garage without worrying about what petty vendetta would come next. And about 6 months after the election, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Patricia had put her house up for sale and was moving to a different community, apparently one with even stricter HOA rules where she thought she'd fit in better. And I won't lie and say I wasn't relieved to hear she was leaving, because life is too short to spend it dealing with people who have nothing better to do than make others miserable over completely imaginary slights and violations. And when she finally moved out in November, almost exactly a year after the garage party incident that started everything, several of the neighbors actually celebrated with a block party, which was ironic considering that's what had triggered Patricia in the first place. And this time there were no 911 calls, no false complaints, just a bunch of neighbors enjoying each other's company and being grateful that they could finally relax without worrying about being reported for having their trash cans out 5 minutes too long or their grass a quarter inch too tall. And I learned a valuable lesson through the whole experience about the importance of documentation, about standing up for yourself when people try to abuse systems and rules to harass you, and about the fact that sometimes karma really does come around, because Patricia had spent so much time and energy trying to make my life difficult, that she'd ultimately made herself miserable and driven herself out of a neighborhood where she could have just lived peacefully if she'd been able to mind her own business. And as for me, I kept living in my house, kept working as a detective, kept restoring motorcycles in my garage, and kept hosting the occasional small gathering of friends and family, and life went on normally and happily without the constant cloud of petty harassment hanging over everything. And I never did find out for certain whether Patricia was the one who spray-painted my garage door, though I have my strong suspicions. But in the end it didn't matter because she was gone and I was free to just be a normal neighbor in a normal neighborhood. And that garage party that had caused so much drama ended up being one of the best parties I'd ever thrown, not because of the food or the decorations or anything I'd planned, but because it had exposed Patricia's true nature to the entire community, and had ultimately led to her removing herself from our lives. And sometimes justice comes in unexpected forms, and sometimes the best revenge is just living well and letting difficult people destroy themselves through their own bitterness and pettiness. And I lived happily ever after in my little suburban house, with my dog Bruno and my restored motorcycle and my peaceful garage, where I could work on projects without worrying about vindictive neighbors calling 911 because they didn't like the fact that I dared to exist and enjoy my own property. And the story of the HOA Karen who called 911 on a police detective's party became legendary in the precinct and in the neighborhood, a cautionary tale about what happens when you let petty grievances and self-righteousness consume your life to the point where you're willing to waste emergency resources and harass your neighbors over absolutely nothing. And I sometimes wondered if Patricia ever had a moment of self-reflection in her new community, if she ever realized that she'd been the problem all along. But I suspect she probably didn't, because people like that rarely do. They just move from place to place, finding new targets for their compulsive need to control and criticize, never understanding that they're the common denominator in all their conflicts. But that wasn't my problem anymore, and I was just grateful to have my peace back and to be surrounded by reasonable neighbors who understood that community living means accepting that people are different and have different lifestyles, and that, as long as no one is actually breaking laws or causing real harm, everyone deserves to live their life without constant surveillance and harassment from busybodies with too much time on their hands and not enough actual problems to worry about.